Good morning and welcome back. Glad to have you back today. We finished forging our hammer the other day, and today we are going to go through the process of grinding and cleaning up the hammer, getting it ready for hardening and tempering. We'll then harden and temper it, dress the edges of the hammer afterwards to clean it all up after hardening and make it ready to work with, and then we'll put a handle on it. So let's get started. So here is the hammerhead that we forged. It's a pretty clean forging, but it's still going to need just a little bit of grinding and finishing to smooth up the face. There's always a little bit of an overlap on the peen when you do it this way. That'll have to be ground off. And you can do this hot rasping before you anneal it. So the last few forging heats, or just heat it up just to hot rasp. You can do it with a file, you can do it with an angle grinder. We'll do it on a belt grinder because that's what I have and it's about the most efficient thing. And we might as well just get the job done. So we started off with a piece of steel, 1 3/8", 4140, 3.5 inches long. We are now at 4 1/4 inches long. This will finish out probably at right at 4 inches. We've actually spread to 1 5/8" that direction and about 1.5 inches this direction. That's fairly typical that things will expand, and you should take that into account if you're trying to hit a specific goal in the end. We also started off, we knew it was 1 pound 13.8 ounces. We are now at 1 pound 10.4 ounces. So we lost a little over 3 ounces just in forging scale. There's been no grinding, no filing, although we did drill the eye hole to start with. So there's a little bit of material loss there. And we're going to lose a little bit more to grinding. So still thinking 1 pound 8 ounces is about what we're going to end up with here, and we will see. So it's off to the grinder. Now anybody that was paying attention probably noticed that I was wearing a polar fleece sweater when I came to the shop this morning because it was a little cool. Absolutely no synthetic clothing anywhere near heat or sparks. So that has to come off for grinding, forging, torch work, welding, anything that involves fire, flame, or sparks. Synthetic clothing is terrible, so that's gone, and I don't recommend it. Shouldn't even wear it to the shop, but it's what I had on when I came up, and now it's hung safely away from everything, so I'm not going to melt it to myself. Okay, we've got our hammerhead all ground. I went through 60 grip belt, 120 and 220 grip belts. to get this all sanded down. And you can see it's still got plenty of character from forging. I just wanted to take any rough spots or high spots off. You can take it down till it's completely clean and shiny if you want to. It doesn't make the hammer swing any better. It just, if that's your aesthetic, go ahead and do it. It doesn't hurt anything. And we were at 4 1/4, we're still at 4 1/8. Excuse me, somebody's been mowing hay in the area and makes me sneeze. So that's cleaned up to 220 grit. After heat treating, I'm not going to do anything to these faces. Excuse me again. But I will come back and polish up the peen and the face a little bit. So let's go to the forge and let's heat treat our hammer. Okay, we're going to go ahead and light the forge for hardening, and then we're going to temper. The gas forge can be way too hot, coal forge can be way too hot for hardening and tempering, so you have to go slow, you have to keep the heat down as much as you can. This isn't a time to really crank on that blower in your coal forge or run the fan way up. Turn the gas pressure down on the gas forge, and let's take this nice and slow, give it time to soak. I'm actually going to cycle the forge on and off several times and give it a little bit of a soak time, and you probably don't want to watch all that, so I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about, but I won't show you every single step and make you stand there or sit in front of your computer and stare at the forge the whole time. Actually go to quench this. My quench bucket is down here right by the forge. I want to hold it this way. That way I can quench the face and then quench the peen and go back and forth. I can quench the whole thing and then come back and draw the temper in the eye a little bit more, and that makes a better hammer. You're less likely to crack the eye at some point in the future. But if you alternate back and forth, then this cools more slowly and it's not as hard to start with. And I'll probably do a little combination of both. Later I'll probably put a piece of steel in there that's red hot to guarantee that that's a little softer right there. Remember, we used 4140 for our hammer. 4140 is a chromoly steel, fairly low carbon, but because of the other elements, it still gets pretty hard. So it's a real good steel for making hammers out of. It's very durable, very resistant to the abuse you put a hammer through. It's an oil hardening steel. And this is one reason to use known steels, is you can look all this up. It's available on the internet. The supplier that you use to buy the steel should have the specs for hardening and tempering. I have an app on my cell phone called the Heat Treater's Guide that has all the specs for hardening and tempering. You can buy books. It's all out there. You can look it up. I know this has to heat to 1,555 degrees, and if I was doing this in the electric oven, I would just set it for that, and I would be able to get it exactly to that temperature. Unfortunately, doing it in the forge, we can't do that. And since most of you don't have an electric oven, we'll do it in the forge. We'll judge color by eye, which is a cherry red at that temperature, which is just a little more than just starting to glow, but not an orange heat, certainly not a full welded forging heat. And it'll also be non-magnetic, but I suspect it loses magnetism a little bit before it reaches critical temperature. The magnet trick is good for simple steels, 1075, 1085, 1095, W1, things like that. 4140, I'm not sure that it's accurate. It's close, and probably give you a good idea, and it doesn't hurt to try it. Test it with a file afterwards. If it's a little soft, re-anneal it, and then harden it again a little hotter. But I have a pretty good idea what the color needs to be in this forge, because I've done this before, and we're going to make it all work out. that come up to heat with the forge. It doesn't need to come up to heat too fast. The slower the better. Now I'm hardening in oil, and oil can burn. So I have it in a little bucket. This is just a 10-gallon rag can, and I have my 5-gallon bucket with my hardening and tempering oil, or hardening oil, set inside there. So if this flares up, all I have to do is drop the piece in there, take my foot off of the foot pedal, and it closes and puts the fire out. A lot of people have burned their shops down because they have spilled flaming oil when they started a fire hardening something. Have a way to cover it, and don't use a plastic bucket. The oil comes in a plastic bucket. Get it into metal. You should also make sure you have a good dry chem fire extinguisher, ABC fire extinguisher. An oil fire is a Class B fire. Water extinguisher, an extinguisher that only puts out Class A fires, will not put out an oil fire safely. So make sure you have a good sized ABC fire extinguisher, readily accessible. Make sure you get it checked every year. Just take it to your local fire extinguisher company. They'll do a few quick tests and make sure it's still charged and that it's still going to function when you need it. It's worth the $10 or $15 they charge you to have that done. I keep this extinguisher between the forge and the door. So if I'm headed for the extinguisher and things get out of hand, I'm on my way to the door already. I'm not trapped in a corner behind the fire. I hope I'm not being too doom and gloomy about fires with this process, but it pays to be cautious. And I'm perhaps more cautious than most. I spent 27 years as a career firefighter in a metropolitan area, and I take fire protection and fire safety quite seriously. And there's no reason to burn your shop down. A fire extinguisher is cheap insurance. Okay, our hammer is starting to come up to heat. It isn't heating evenly because of thick and thin spots, and the forge isn't all that hot. But I'm going to go ahead and turn the fire off and just let it soak in the hot forge for about 5 minutes. And then I'll turn the fire back on and let it come up to heat a little bit more. I want the whole thing to be evenly hot throughout, and a thick section of steel like a hammer can look hot on the surface and still be too cold in the middle to properly harden and temper. And that not only affects the hardness of the hammer, but it's a good way to invite cracks by uneven heating. Okay, we cycled the forge on and off a few times. It's getting much more evenly hot now. And my magnet doesn't stick, so that's probably about right. I'm going to let it soak one more time with the forge off, just to guarantee it's heated evenly all the way through, but I don't want to get it any hotter than it is right now. On the other hand, you should always quench at a rising heat. You don't want to let it cool down to critical temperature. You want to be bringing it up to critical temperature and then quench it. If it's cooling down, you've already gone too far. It pays to turn this end for end every now and then and make sure it's really heating as evenly as it possibly can. There's enough heat remaining in the forge now I don't have to use a torch or match to light this. It'll just light itself. Okay, we want to go ahead and quench that. And Going back and forth. And the only way to get that's mostly just oil burning on the surface of the hammer right now, so I don't really worry about it. Although it's better for your oil if it doesn't burn, so we can put the fire out. Fortunately, that makes a lot more smoke. You don't want to breathe this smoke. I really need an exhaust fan. Okay, now it's close. I'm just going to quench the whole thing. Like I say, we'll come back and specifically address the eye and heat it. Heat up a piece of steel and stick it in the eye to temper that a little bit more than we temper the faces back. It takes a long time to cool this completely. If you keep it moving in the oil, you keep it from developing just a little hot pocket in the oil or a little pocket of bubbles that keep it from hardening properly. Okay, that should be pretty good. So there's our hammer, hardened and tempered and nice and black from the oil, which I kind of like. So I'm going to put this in a toaster oven to temper it. There's another way we can do that, and we'll discuss that after this initial tempering. Now before I temper this, I would like to make sure that it really hardened properly. So I'm going to test it real quick with a file. If the file skates, it's really hard. And that file cuts just a little bit. And that's okay, because that's still harder than I want it in the long run. I would like it to file just a little easier than that after it's tempered. But that means it's hard enough, and tempering will soften it that little bit. Now, somebody in an earlier video had commented that the file test is not always accurate due to decarburization of the steel. And that's true. It's possible that I've had a little decarburizing. I've already ground any decarb off in the initial grinding, and there would be very little from the hardening process. But if it cuts really easy the first stroke, give it a few more. You'll get through that. That's only a few thousandths of an inch thick, if it at all. And you get down, that's good and hard. That doesn't want to cut very easily. So it needs to be tempered. So I keep this little toaster oven in the shop. Unfortunately, it only goes up to 450 degrees, and I'd probably rather temper that at more like 500 to 550. At 450, it's still going to be pretty hard, and it just does, for working hot iron, it doesn't need to be that hard. You increase the risk of chipping. The kitchen oven usually goes up to 500 or 5 1/4. If you're going to do these in the kitchen oven, make sure you give it a soap and water bath first, so that you don't stink it up with burning heat treat oil, because it really stinks when it smokes. So that's going to sit in there for an hour, and then we'll be back. Well, it's been a little over an hour. The hammerhead has been hardened. It has been tempered the first time. It's a good idea for most steels to give it 2 tempering cycles. It just makes sure that it's done right and make sure that it is even. And as I mentioned, the toaster oven only goes up to 450, and I would rather temper this more like 500 or even 550. It just doesn't need to be super hard. It's not a cutting edge, and it's better for your hammer to deform a little bit than it is for it to chip. And the secondary method of tempering, and the method we'll use for our second tempering, is to heat up something that is shaped roughly like your drift to red hot and drop the hammerhead over the red hot pin. and then rotate it every now and then. You'll have to use a pair of tongs. And this will heat this area up more than the head and the peen, and allow the transition here, a variable temper. So this stays fairly hard on both ends, but is softer in the middle, because the eye is where it might crack, other than chipping at the face because you did something like hitting your anvil with it. So we're going to heat this up, we're going to put it in the vise, and then we're going to set this over the top. When you're tempering this way, you need to watch for color change, so you have to clean this up and bring it back to a somewhat shiny state, a little bit back from the face and from the peen, so you can watch the color change. I actually prefer to leave that all black and only clean up the face and the peen itself, because I think it looks better. But after this has been in the shop for a year or so, it's all going to look the same anyways, and you won't even notice that you've done this. Okay, we've got our pin good and hot. You want a pretty good heat on this thing because it's going to take a while to do this, and if you don't get it hot enough, you probably won't see what's happening, or you won't get a good temper. So what we're going to do is just set that on there and let it sit. This may take quite a while. I've actually taken another heat on this pin because it was cooling down fast and the hammer wasn't showing any color at all at that point. Flip it over every now and then. You want it to heat as evenly as possible, and keep an eye on both the face and the peen. If the peen starts to show color change earlier than the face, you may need to quench just the peen. What we're looking for is a bronze to a peacock color. It's kind of hard to see the color change on the camera, but that's turning a nice straw to bronze. So that's almost where we want it. The peen is heating up at about the same rate. The pin is cooling down quite a bit, so it's not heating up fast. This is a very nice controlled way to do this. I've actually had to reheat the pin one time. Just set the hammer aside, it stays pretty hot. Bring the pin back up to a bright red heat and put it back on there. Getting the slightest hint of purple, so that purple to bronze range is what we refer to as peacock. And that's probably about 550. There are color charts available in some books and online that'll give you a better idea of what that temperature is. But I think that's about ready to go ahead and quench. And you quench it because it's still hotter right here in the across the peen than it is at the face, and if you just set it aside, more heat's going to continue to travel, and you may temper it a little bit softer than you want. And I'm just going to quench the whole thing, cooling it off so I can handle it again. The next step, I'm going to go ahead and finish cleaning up the face and the peen. This will be the finished grinding that I'm going to do, and it's close enough to finish that I can go back to the 220 belt, and I don't think I need to go much more than that for a hammer of this sort. Now this is the same as dressing your hammer if you've been using it and it's started to mushroom over a little bit. You just clean it up, get it smooth, make sure there's no sharp edges. You do want the peen relatively flat across the middle, but you want to make sure there's no sharp corners on it. You even want the face pretty flat. That's really all that takes. Okay, so here is the finished hammerhead. I've dressed and cleaned up the face and the peen, and I put it on a wire wheel to kind of blend where I had ground back to see the tempering colors, so that it isn't quite as stark a change from black forged to ground and cleaned up. And I think that makes it look a little bit better, but there's still plenty of hand forged character on that hammer. Our final weight is 1 pound 9.2 ounces, so that's a 25-ounce hammer. And I actually took the time before hardening and tempering to stamp that on the back, under what will be the underside. I put my touch mark on the top side, and that way I know in the future kind of what that weighs. Now remember, we started off with 1 pound 13.8 ounces, so we've lost over 4 ounces of material doing this. Our finished length is still right at 4 1/8 inches, so that's a pretty good size hammer. The only thing remaining to make this a usable tool, unless you want to use it like this, is to put a handle on it. So that'll be our next step. And because we made our drift to match as closely as possible the handle that we had on hand, which by the way comes with a wooden wedge and a steel wedge. Try to do this without cutting myself. Time to sharpen my pocket knife. It's that tough piece of tape they put on there. Now, frequently the wedges that come with these, I think that steel wedge may be a little big, and that wedge isn't too bad. It'll probably be okay. But anyways, so the hammer handle is very close to fitting. If I take a look at that, the length is almost perfect, and the width is just a little wide. So you can clean this up with a knife. You want to. You can whittle that. Like I say, this knife needs to be sharpened, but you could probably whittle it pretty readily. You can use a rasp, maybe even a coarse file, because there's very little that has to come off of this one, or you can sand it down. There's just, however you feel like cleaning that off, you want it to just go in, and take your time getting this to fit just right. Well, it looks like the microphone that I was wearing finally died. The battery was getting low. So we're trying to take a close look at the hammer here and make sure that the head is going on straight, that the hammer is not leaned one side to the other, and that it's perpendicular with the end of the handle. By using a mallet to drive the end of the handle into the head, without the head being supported, you're using the inertia of the head to bring the head up onto the handle. That's the ideal way to do it. Here the saw kerf doesn't quite extend to the end, so I'm going to knock the head back off and do a little bit more trimming on the handle and then try the fit up again. There are some shoulders forming where the head has been driven into the handle that show you where it's too small. If you trim to those shoulders, you can work those off and get the head to slide down a little bit easier. And again, you can do that with a knife if you want to, or we can take it back to the belt grinder, because that is the quickest, most efficient way in my shop. So we're back again after a little trip to the belt grinder, and we're going to drive the handle on one more time and see if it fits. Again, we're using the inertia of the head to drive it onto the handle, and that looks like a pretty good fit. Give it one more last look to make sure it's all lined up just the way you want it. Once you put the wedges in, the only way to get it back off is going to be to cut the handle off and drive the slug out. Yeah, it looks like I decided to go one more time here. So we're going to take that back off of there. And it's fitting so tightly it doesn't want to come off, even driving the top with a mallet. So we're going to pad the head and hang it in the vise. It's not clamped in the vise, it's just hanging. And then we'll use a punch that is as close to the size of the eye as possible and drive that handle back out again. So, time to go back to the grinder, and we'll make a quick trim of this and get it all fit very nicely. So, back from the grinder one more time. It's amazing how fast that is. Now, I'd like to deepen that saw kerf a little bit so we get more of the wedge in. We've got the handle to go in plenty far enough now. You can use any kind of a woodworking saw, but you're in a blacksmith shop and a hacksaw is going to work just fine. So we'll just trim that a little bit. It only needed to go another 1/4 inch or so. That's all it takes. Plenty to get that wedge in. Put the head on. Now remember, I stamped my touch mark on the top, so you don't want to accidentally put this on upside down, or your touch mark's on the underside and the weight's on top. Not a big deal, but you took the time to have a plan, you might as well stick to it. So go ahead and start the wedge this way with a metal hammer, but my preference is to actually invert the whole thing and support the wedge on a solid surface. Generally I do this on an anvil, and frequently I glue the wedge in, but this keeps the wedge from splitting and drives it very evenly. And at the same time, you're using that inertia from the head to keep the handle seated firmly on the handle. Or the head seated firmly on the handle. A little bit more handle sticks out than I'd like, so again, back to the hacksaw real quick. It cuts wood just fine. And we'll trim that off. And then I get rid of the portable microphone and go back to the camera so we'll have sound. So I've sawed that off with a hacksaw, and I want to clean it up just a little bit on the sander here, or the grinder. And we'll do the same thing. This one's got a 220 belt on it, so we'll use it for the set of changing belts on that one. I want to try not to leave grinder marks on the hammerhead. So I leave that a little proud, but now it's nice and smooth, looks prettier. Time to put the wedge in it, or the steel wedge in it. You don't always have to use steel wedges, and I frequently do not on things that are going out because the risk of splitting the top of the head is quite high. Now, it doesn't actually hurt anything in most cases. Or not the top of the head, the top of the handle. But people don't like the look of it, so I tend not to do that for things that I've sold. But you can see that went pretty well. So here is the hammer hung on a handle. The only thing that is really left to do right now is looks like a grubby blacksmith has had his hands all over it. And you know what? If I'm going to use it in the shop, I just don't care, because that handle's going to be black in no time. if it's something going out to a customer, I try and clean it up. One way to do that is just scraping. You can do that with the side of a knife. You can see I'm getting little scrapings off of that. The other thing you can do is just sand it. And there's nothing wrong with power sanding it. Whatever you want to do with it. Like I say, if you're using it in the shop, who cares? Wouldn't hurt to put some linseed oil on it. Probably needs to dry for a few days after you do that. So if you want to use it right away, just skip that step. I've got lots of tools that never had oil on it. That'd be enough grease and oil in my hands from working in the shop. So pretty much, that is our completed 25-ounce cross peen hammer. So, thanks for stopping by today. That finishes our hammer video. I will still do a third part that isn't specific to this hammer, but is just discussing some of the options, things that might make your life easier, ways to punch if you don't have a drill press, to use the drill press method of getting that hole established. In the meantime, make sure you subscribe to the channel, share this with your friends. Like the video. If you don't like it, let me know. You can give it a thumbs down. I'm a big boy, I can take it. And then we'll see you next time. Have a good day.